I've been using the M1 Mac Mini now for about 3 weeks, and I thought with this channel giving so much love to the M1 MacBook Air recently, I would give Apple's little desktop powerhouse a bit more love. Welcome back to Ellis Reviews. Thank you as always for subscribing if you have. If you haven't, just click the subscribe button, click the little bell and you will never miss an episode. A few weeks back I replaced this great big 16-inch MacBook Pro, which cost me £3,500, with a M1 Mac Mini, which cost me £1,100. And the Mini, over the last 3 weeks, has completely run my business. It's done everything from the normal kind of business admin type stuff to 4K video editing, audio editing, lots of writing, Zoom calls, you name it. It's done literally everything. I haven't really touched the 16-inch MacBook Pro. And the reason for doing this was that I wanted to see how it performed, if it either outperformed itself, if it struggled at any point, if it frustrated me, if it surprised me, and ultimately, was it a worthy successor to the 16-inch? And more importantly than that, if you are thinking of buying an M1 Mac Mini, will my experience sway you either way? Let's get into it. So in terms of the specs that I went for, with the M1 Mac Mini you get one processor choice, which is basically the 8-core version of the M1 with the 8-core graphics, but I upped the RAM to 16 gig and increased the storage to 512 gig. Now that set me back 1,100 UK pounds, and if I added in my MSI 34-inch widescreen monitor, Keychron keyboard, Logitech MX Master mouse, the total was about £1,500. And if you compare that to the 16-inch MacBook Pro, that cost me £3,500. So how does that relate in terms of performance? Well, put it this way, the M1 Mac Mini, as far as I'm concerned, having used it for 3 weeks non-stop for my business, it's absolutely effortless. A lot of people have talked about this kind of snappiness that you get with the M1 chip. So I've experienced that with the M1 Air 100%, and you get the exact same thing, unsurprisingly, with the Mac Mini. And when we say snappiness, it's a case of there's just no waiting for anything really. You do realise that the Intel machines have always been plagued a little bit with slow startup times of apps and just a bit sluggishness, to be honest. Even the 16-inch MacBook Pro I experienced that with. You know, you'd see the beach ball more often than you'd ever expect to or want to see it. Not that you ever want to see it, but with the M1 Mac Mini, that doesn't happen. Now, the majority of the apps that I use are M1 native, so they've been designed for the M1 chip. They've been updated to make the most of it. But I do still use some old Intel-based software. So things like, for example, Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop, at the moment they don't run natively on the M1. They run through something called Rosetta 2, which is basically a way of the Mac Mini or any M1 Mac emulating an Intel computer. Really simple. You have to install the Rosetta 2 software once, which it prompts you to do when you first try and open an Intel piece of software. But that's it, you do it once and it then just runs. Even with those apps, and heavy duty apps, you know, Photoshop and Lightroom, it's serious stuff. They just work so flawlessly. There's no hint that it's emulating them. But where it's really, really shined for me is with video editing. Now, as you can guess, I do a lot of video editing every week, and it's 4K, you know, there's a lot of footage, lots of different angles quite often. Now, my 16-inch MacBook Pro effortlessly copes with that. The only thing that happens with it is that it gets very hot and the fans sound it like it's about to take off. M1 Mac Mini, by comparison, feels identical to this. That's no joke. I cannot notice any difference really. The only thing you occasionally get is a couple of drop frames, and that is when Final Cut Pro is struggling to keep up with what you're doing. But even that has probably happened twice, and I've edited the last 3 or 4 videos that you've seen on this channel on the M1 Mac Mini. It just hasn't slowed me down at all. Now, I've not done any kind of render test. I did do a comparison between the 16-inch MacBook Pro and the M1 MacBook Air, which I'll put a link to up here somewhere. And in that test, just to save you watching it, the M1 Air beat the 16-inch in terms of a render test in Final Cut Pro, but the 16-inch MacBook Pro beat the Air fairly comprehensively in the export test, once again in Final Cut Pro. Now, I've not done that test between the M1 Mac Mini and the 16-inch at all. I haven't done it yet. I will do probably at some stage. But just from real-world experience, it doesn't feel particularly slower in that respect either. Now, it is a little bit slower, there's no getting away from it. It takes a little bit longer to render footage, and the exports, I think, take a bit longer. But it's all of the words you're hearing a bit longer, kinda, you know. I'm not sitting here thinking, oh God, I wish I was using this. I just don't. I just wait a little bit longer for it. It still enables me to carry on with other stuff while I'm waiting for things to render, which is a key point actually. This is something which a lot of comparisons don't take into account, is the fact that if you are a video editor or you're someone who creates video content, when you are editing stuff and you're waiting for things to render, you will quite often dip into your emails or perhaps go somewhere else on the computer to do a different task. Now, it's crucial at that stage that the computer lets you do that. If it kind of says, whoa, hang on a minute, I've had laptops that have done this in the past. If it kind of says, no, I need to finish this render before you can carry on, that's an issue. From a productivity perspective, I need to get on with stuff if I'm waiting for a render. The Mac Mini excels at that. I've had no problems with that whatsoever, and it just does not feel particularly different to the 16-inch, which I think speaks volumes. I've had the exact same experience with Lightroom. I do a lot of photo editing, you know, all of the thumbnails, etc. that I do for the channel are all done within Lightroom, and quite often I have to do them very quickly. Same thing for my blog. If I'm doing an image for the blog, I take the photo, upload it onto the Mac Mini, edit it in Lightroom, and it's just so quick. Nothing slows me down. It's fantastic. I've used Logic Pro to a fair extent with it, and again, using some fairly heavy duty plugins from the likes of Waves, etc. It's fantastic. The only downside with Logic is that there is some incompatibility with certain plugins. For example, if you use Native Instruments Massive, or Massive X, the most recent one, at the moment it's not compatible. That will hopefully change, but despite that, I've tested the ones that do work, and again, I just can't notice any difference between producing music on this compared to the 16-inch. Now, I will at some stage do a proper comparison of that and do a video on it as well from a music production perspective. But again, it just doesn't feel any different. So here's the point with the way this thing performs. If you do any form of processor intensive work on your current Mac, and it's perhaps an Intel Mac, I genuinely don't think you will see a difference if you switch to an M1 Mac Mini, or the M1 MacBook Pro to be fair, because they're basically the same machine. They both have the fan, which the Air doesn't have. They both have the 8-core graphics processor, which the base level Air doesn't have. I just don't think you'll notice much of, if at all, a difference. One thing I have not noticed at all is the fan. This thing is completely silent. It doesn't get warm. You know, I've been editing this morning, not warm at all, and it just sits there silently doing absolutely seemingly nothing. You just cannot make it sweat. I thought it's worth mentioning the fact that I went for the 16 gig version here, because there's been a lot of talk about 8 gig versus 16 gig. I do think that Apple are changing the perception of this, actually. I think for many years we've always thought that you need as much RAM as possible, and while I still agree that you should spend as much as you can on RAM, it's becoming less of an issue, I think. I'm glad I went with the 16 gig version. That said, I could afford to upgrade, which was great, and it's nice just to know I've got that headroom. However, I run iStat menus on this Mac, and it's always got, seemingly, at least 50% memory in reserve. That's with lots of apps open. It's with Final Cut open, Spotify, Slack, Teams, Safari, Spark Email, and lots of others, Discord, etc. It's still got over 50% of memory left. The way that's impacted the way that I use this machine is that I no longer worry about leaving apps open at all. I've become quite complacent with it, really, simply because it just doesn't make any difference to the performance. I don't know what it does. I don't know what the M1 chip does with memory management, but it's very smart. So it's nice to have that 16 gig headroom. If you're really struggling with the budget, the 8 gig will still do you very well, I'd put it that way. If you can spend a bit more, do it, but just bear in mind that the headroom you'll get with the 16 gig M1 is far more headroom than you'll get with a 16 gig Intel machine. Now, it's not all roses with this M1 Mac. One thing I have to address, and by the time you watch this video, it may hopefully have been fixed, is the Bluetooth problems, which you may or may not have heard about. I wasn't sure they existed when I first got the Mac, probably because I was so excited to use it, but since it's been in place and I've been connecting more Bluetooth devices to it, I've noticed more problems, and they're significant, to be fair. So just very quickly, the problem is that third-party and Apple devices that are wireless, that rely on a Bluetooth connection, are having trouble maintaining that connection with the M1 Mac Mini. Now, the way that manifests itself day to day is, for example, I now have my Keychron K2 keyboard permanently attached via USB. My Logitech MX Master 3, I'm having to use the dongle that comes with it rather than Bluetooth, simply because neither of them will maintain a consistent connection to the M1 Mac Mini. It's the same thing with headphones. If I try and attach a pair of AirPods, for example, or even a third-party pair of headphones, the connection drops in and out. And I've been getting really weird problems in this studio with Bluetooth, and I've got no way to kind of confirm this is the case, but I do wonder if it's related to this computer. So for example, if I attach my AirPods Pro to the 27-inch iMac behind me, historically, no problem at all. Now, since I've had the M1 Mac Mini in this room, the audio keeps cutting out on that. And if I'm on a Teams call, for example, the people I'm talking to tell me that I keep cutting it in and out until I take out the AirPods and go for the internal speakers. Weird. Similar thing with my iPhone. I have issues with the iPhone connected to my AirPods Max, sorry. The issue is that it just doesn't maintain the connection. It keeps dropping out. Again, whether or not this is related to this M1 Mac Mini, I don't know. And hopefully, as I mentioned a moment ago, there is a fix on the way from Apple. So I'm just hoping beyond hope that the next version of macOS fixes this. If it doesn't, it's actually a roadblock. It's a game changer for a lot of people, because not everyone wants to do this. I don't. I want to use this as Bluetooth. I can't at the moment because I can't rely on the M1 Mac Mini's Bluetooth connection, which is such a shame, because it taints the experience of this amazing computer. The other thing is the lack of ports, and we can't really escape this. The M1 Mac Mini only has 2 USB-A ports and 2 USB-C ports. There's all sorts of theories as to why this is the case, but I think it's quite simple. I just think the M1 architecture can't cope with any more than that at the moment. It's not the end of the world, but it's a bit frustrating. I mean, at the moment, all of those ports are taken up with various things. I would say if you don't mind using dongles and hubs, USB hubs, etc., then you probably won't have an issue. However, if you want a Mac, an M1 powered Mac with lots of connectivity and you can hold on, just wait 2 or 3 months to see what arrives, because this first generation of the M1 chip, that's all you get. In conclusion, I think this M1 Mac Mini is game changing. Just the fact that it is so much less expensive than this 16-inch MacBook Pro, the Intel version, and that it feels, I'm not joking, identical. There are those little differences, like you occasionally get a bit of slowness in Final Cut Pro, but they're so few and far between. It's just staggering, I think, how well this thing performs. It's also a really cost-effective entry point into the Mac ecosystem. The Mac Mini's always been seen as that, really. It's the cheapest way to get a Mac, but just the sheer power you get with this one makes it even more worthwhile. And there's none of the Apple tax that you get with, for example, AirPods Max or $35 auxiliary cables. That doesn't exist with this Mac Mini. You're getting an awful lot for your money. So if you want a powerful M1 based Mac desktop and don't mind buying a separate keyboard, mouse and monitor, you might want to do that, then I'd get it. I really would. The only thing to bear in mind is this Bluetooth issue, and I really do hope that by the time you watch this video, it's been fixed. Because once that's fixed, there are literally, unless the lack of ports is an issue for you, there's no reason not to buy one of these. But I will be doing more tests, I'll be doing some more workflow videos, so make sure you subscribe to see those in the future. And yeah, I'll be giving my usual updates on it as the months roll on. But my first experiences with this computer have just been amazing. However, if you are more of a MacBook person and you are interested in getting into the M1 world, then I recently did a comparison, or like a buying guide, between the M1 MacBook Air and the M1 MacBook Pro, because I know it's not an easy decision to make, which has been proven in the comments to my videos. People are a bit confused about which one to go for. Hopefully that video will help you, and if you're interested to watch that, keep watching and there'll be a link to it at the end of this one. In the meantime, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you next time.